The day I walked out of that office for the last time, I smiled the whole drive home. I want you to remember that. I smiled. My name is Harold Simmons. I'm 81 years old, and it took me the better part of a decade after that drive to understand that the smile on my face that afternoon was the most expensive lie I ever told myself. I had worked for 39 years at the same company, the same industry, rising from a junior account manager at 22 years old to the regional vice president of operations by the time I was 54. I wore that title like a second skin. Harold Simmons, regional vice president. I had it on my business cards, on my office door, on the little engraved plate my assistant ordered from my desk the week I was promoted. I used to run my finger across those letters sometimes when I was sitting alone in the office late at night. Harold Simmons, Regional Vice President. It felt like proof of something. Proof that all the early mornings and the missed dinners and the weekends spent in airport terminals had amounted to something real, something permanent, something that could not be taken away. The retirement party was on a Friday evening in October. The company rented out the second floor of a restaurant downtown, one of those places with dark wood paneling and low lighting, and waiters in white shirts who refill your water glass before you even notice it's half empty. There were maybe 70, 80 people there, colleagues, managers, a few clients I had worked with for years. My wife, Margaret, was there in the blue dress she always wore to company events because she knew I loved that dress. My daughter Claire drove in from Philadelphia. My son David flew in from Seattle, which I thought was a remarkable gesture at the time, though looking back now I understand it differently. He came because his mother asked him to, and because even he sensed it was one of those events you don't get a second chance to attend. There were speeches. There was a cake. Someone had put together a slideshow of photographs from across my career, me at different ages, at different company events, shaking hands with people I barely remembered anymore, standing in front of buildings that some of those companies don't even occupy anymore. I sat at the head table and watched 39 years of my life scroll across a projector screen, and I felt enormously proud. That is the truth. I felt proud and full and certain that I had spent my time on earth wisely. What I did not notice, what I was constitutionally incapable of noticing in that moment, was that the slideshow contained almost no photographs of my family. There were a handful. My wedding day, because someone must have found it in my desk. A photo from a company family picnic in the early 90s, where David was maybe 8 years old, and Claire was 5, and they were both squinting into the sun. But the rest of it, the overwhelming majority of those images, was work. Offices and conferences and handshakes and certificates. The visual record of my adult life laid out for everyone to see was a record of my career, and I sat there and watched it and felt proud. Margaret drove us home that night. I had drunk a little more than usual, not badly, but enough that she took the keys without discussion, the way she had learned to do over the years without making a production of it. I remember the streets were wet from an earlier rain, and the streetlights were throwing long orange reflections across the pavement. I sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window and felt something I could not name. Not sadness exactly, not fear. Something quieter than either of those, something closer to the feeling you get at the very end of a long book when you've turned the last page and you're just sitting there holding it, not quite ready to put it down. I told myself it was just the wine and the emotion of the day. I told myself I would feel better in the morning. For the first few weeks, retirement was everything I had imagined it would be. Margaret and I slept in late, which we hadn't done on a weekday in decades. We had long breakfasts together. I read the newspaper from front to back instead of skimming the headlines on my phone between meetings. I started going to the gym in the mornings, which I had been promising myself I would do for years. I felt, in those first weeks, like a man who had just taken off a coat he'd been wearing so long he'd forgotten it had weight. But somewhere around the 6-week mark, something shifted. It was subtle at first, the way a change in weather is subtle. You don't notice the cold coming in until you realize your shoulders have been tensed up for an hour. I would wake up in the morning and lie in bed and think, now what? Not with distress, not yet. Just with a kind of blankness. The day would stretch out in front of me, and I wouldn't know what shape to give it. My whole adult life, the shape of my days had been decided for me. There were meetings and deadlines and problems that needed solving and people who needed answers from me. I had never once in 39 years had to decide what my life was for. The job decided. The job always decided. And now the job was gone, and I was lying in bed at 7 in the morning staring at the ceiling, and the question was just sitting there, quiet and patient as a stone. Now what, Harold? Now what? I started going into my home office every morning out of habit. Margaret had converted the guest bedroom into a proper office for me years ago. A good desk, bookshelves, a leather chair. I would go in there after breakfast and sit down and open my laptop and then just sit. I didn't have emails to answer anymore. I didn't have reports to review. The calendar on my laptop was empty for the first time in my adult life, and I would look at it sometimes, all those blank white squares, and feel something in my chest that I can only describe as vertigo, like the floor had dropped away and I was standing on nothing. I think that is when I started to understand dimly that something was wrong. Not wrong with my health or my marriage or my circumstances, wrong with the construction of my life. Because I sat in that office, in that house, I had worked my entire career to own outright, and I could not find a single thing I genuinely wanted to do. Not one. And I thought, surely that can't be right. Surely a man of 67 years has accumulated interests, passions, things he cares about beyond the boundaries of his work. But when I sat quietly and searched for them, I found almost nothing. I had played golf in my 30s, but I had stopped when the travel schedule made it too complicated, and somewhere in the years since then, the desire had simply evaporated. I had loved jazz music as a young man, had owned records, had gone to clubs in the city when Margaret and I were first dating. But I hadn't listened to jazz in probably 15 years, and I wasn't sure I still cared about it. I had told myself for 2 decades that I wanted to travel, that once I retired Margaret and I would go to Portugal, to Japan, to the national parks out west I'd never seen. But now that the time was there, open and available, the desire felt abstract, like wanting something you've read about in a book rather than something that lives inside you. What I discovered in those slow and bewildering months was that I had maintained my interests the same way some men maintain a vacation home they never visit, paying the idea of them forward, telling myself they were waiting for me, without ever actually tending to them. And in the meantime, without my noticing, they had quietly gone to ruin. Margaret tried. I want to be honest about that. She suggested things. A pottery class at the community center, volunteering at the hospital, a memoir writing group she had heard about through a friend. She suggested all of these things gently, carefully, the way you suggest things to a person you have learned over 50 years to handle with some degree of delicacy. And I would listen and nod and say, yes, maybe, that sounds like a good idea. And then I would not do any of them. I wasn't resisting her. I wasn't being stubborn, or at least I didn't think I was. I just couldn't locate the energy to begin. Every morning felt like standing at the edge of a very cold lake. You tell yourself you'll get in, and then somehow the morning passes, and you're still standing on the shore. Looking back, I can see what was happening. I was grieving. I was grieving the loss of the only identity I had ever really built for myself, and I had no tools for it because I had never thought to build any others. Harold Simmons, Regional Vice President. That was who I was. That was the architecture of my self-understanding. And it was gone now, and I had nothing underneath it. No foundation of private selfhood, no rich interior life that had been quietly growing all those years. Just the job, just the title, just the long echo of a career that was over. There was an afternoon in the second year of my retirement, and this is the afternoon I think about more than any other, the one I come back to in quiet moments and in the hours before sleep, when Margaret went to visit her sister for a long weekend. It was March, a gray Saturday, one of those late winter days when the sky is the color of old concrete, and the light is thin and flat and gives everything a slightly washed-out look. I was alone in the house. I had been alone in the house before, of course, many times over the years, but those times I had always had work to fill the space, a report to finish, calls to return, something to anchor the day to the external world. This time there was nothing. I made myself a cup of coffee, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I looked around the house. Really looked the way you rarely look at the things that surround you every day. The house was everything we had wanted it to be when we bought it. High ceilings, good light when the sun was out. The kitchen we had renovated in 2003. The yard that Margaret kept beautifully. It was a genuinely lovely house, and I had worked for the better part of my adult life to be able to own it outright, to live in it without financial worry, to give my family a home that was solid and paid for and permanent. And I sat there at that kitchen table alone with my cup of coffee going cold, and I felt absolutely nothing. No comfort in the surroundings, no warmth, no sense of arrival or accomplishment. The house was just a house. The quiet was just silence. And the thought came to me, slow and clear and completely unwelcome. Is this what I was building toward? Is this it? This gray Saturday, this cold cup of coffee, this empty kitchen in this beautiful house that no longer has any idea what it's supposed to mean. I don't know how long I sat there. A long time. Long enough for the light to change and the gray afternoon to begin its slow collapse toward evening. I sat there and I let the thought carry me backward through my life, the way you sometimes let a current carry you in a river, not fighting it, just going where it takes you. I thought about the dinners I had missed, not the occasional dinner, not the times that were genuinely unavoidable. I mean the pattern of them, the habit of them, the quiet agreement I had made with myself somewhere in my late 30s that the dinners were the sacrifice and the work was the reward, and that this was a fair trade and one my family would eventually understand and appreciate. I thought about David's first year of high school when he had tried out for the baseball team and made it, and I had managed to attend exactly 2 games. Not because I was a bad father. I was not, I don't think, a bad father. But because the games were on Tuesday afternoons, and Tuesday afternoons were unavailable. That was the word I used. Unavailable. As though I were a conference room. As though my time belonged to something other than my own son standing on a baseball diamond. I thought about Claire's wedding rehearsal dinner, which I missed because there was a crisis at work that my deputy could have handled, that my deputy was capable of handling, but that I had told myself required my presence because I had been telling myself that about every crisis for 30 years, and I didn't know how to stop. I made it to the wedding. I walked her down the aisle, and I was present for that, and I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life. But the rehearsal dinner, the night before, the small family gathering where people were relaxed and laughing, and the evening had no obligation attached to it. I missed that. And Claire smiled at me the next morning at the wedding as if everything was fine, because she had spent her whole childhood learning to smile at me as if everything was fine. And that smile, 30 years later, sitting at my kitchen table on a gray March afternoon, broke my heart open in a way I hadn't expected. I thought about Margaret. This is the hardest part to speak about, and I want to try to do it honestly because I think it is the most important part. Margaret is a remarkable woman, intelligent, patient, deeply loving, in the specific and unglamorous way that real long love requires. She raised our children with a level of presence and attentiveness that I can see clearly now, even if I failed to see it clearly then. She built a life for our family while I was in airports and conference rooms and hotel rooms in cities I can no longer remember. She did all of it without bitterness, without ultimatums, without the kind of resentment that would have been entirely understandable. She loved me steadily and uncomplainingly for 51 years, and I provided for her. I was faithful to her. I told her I loved her, and I meant it. But I was not there. Not really, not in the way that matters, not in the way that fills the actual hours and minutes of a shared life. I was a good husband by the standards I had inherited from my own father, who was also largely absent, who also worked with great dedication, who also sat at the end of his life in a quiet house, wondering where the years had gone. I sat at that kitchen table, and I understood with a particular clarity that only comes when you are very still and very alone, and there is nothing left to distract you, that I had made a series of choices across 50 years that were perfectly logical and perfectly understandable, and that had quietly cost me almost everything that actually mattered. And the devastating thing, the thing that made the gray afternoon feel so heavy and so final, was that no one had made me do any of it. There was no villain in the story, no terrible boss who held a gun to my head, no catastrophic circumstance that left me no choice. I had chosen it. Every early departure, every missed dinner, every Saturday afternoon in the office, every vacation cut short by a work call. I had chosen all of it, freely, because the work felt important, and the other things felt like they could wait. And they had waited, and they were still waiting. And now the account was due, and I was sitting at a kitchen table with nothing in my hands. I want to be careful here, because I don't want you to hear this as a story with no redemption in it. It is not that kind of story. Margaret came home from her sister's house that Sunday evening, and I was waiting for her at the door, which I don't think I had done in years. I told her, right there in the entryway with her coat still on, that I was sorry. Not for any one specific thing, but for the pattern of things, for the accumulated weight of all the small choices that had added up to a particular kind of absence. She stood there, and she looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her eyes that was complicated, relief, maybe, and sadness, and something that looked like it had been waiting a very long time to be released. She hugged me. She just stepped forward and hugged me, right there in the entryway, and I held her, and I thought, this is what I was always building toward, not the title, not the house, not the retirement party with the slideshow and the speeches. This moment, this woman, this life I had been so busy securing that I had barely had the time to actually live it. We went to Portugal the following year. We went in September when the light there is thick and golden and warm, and we spent 3 weeks doing very little, just walking and eating and sitting in squares in the late afternoon, watching the world move at its own pace. We called Claire from a little restaurant overlooking the water one evening just to hear her voice. David met us in Lisbon for the last 5 days, and we ate dinners together that lasted 3 hours, long and wandering and full of the kind of conversation that requires no particular agenda, just the willingness to sit and be present with each other. I am not going to tell you that those weeks undid everything. They didn't. You cannot compress 50 years of absence into 3 weeks of presence and call it even. But something softened, something that had been holding itself rigid for a very long time began, slowly and carefully, to let go. I am 81 now. Margaret and I have our mornings together. We drink coffee and we talk about nothing in particular, what we heard on the radio, what the garden needs, what we remember about some unremarkable Tuesday 40 years ago that has somehow survived in both of our memories. I call David on Thursday evenings. I drive to see Claire once a month. I have started listening to jazz again, slowly, tentatively, the way you ease back into something you once loved and aren't sure loves you back. Sometimes it does. Sometimes I put on a record, and I sit in my chair, and I close my eyes, and I am 24 years old again in a small dark club with Margaret beside me, and the music is doing something inside me that nothing else has ever done quite the same way. I don't know how much time I have left. At 81, you are aware of time in a way that is hard to describe to someone who hasn't yet arrived here, not with panic, not with dread, but with a kind of sharpened attention. Each morning has a weight to it. Each ordinary evening matters more than it used to. What I want to say to you, and I mean this for whoever you are, whatever age you are, wherever this finds you, is that the thing you are postponing is not waiting as patiently as you think it is. The people in your life are not waiting as patiently as you think they are, not because they are impatient or demanding, but because time moves, whether you are paying attention to it or not. And one ordinary afternoon you will look up and discover that what you were saving for later has quietly become the past. I am not asking you to stop working or stop building or stop caring about your career. I am asking you to consider whether you know right now, in some honest and specific way, what you're building it for. Not the abstract idea of security or success or providing for your family, but the actual texture of the life you want to be living, the actual faces and rooms and afternoons that you want to add up to something at the end of a long and well-spent time on earth. Because I sat in a beautiful house on a gray March afternoon, and I could not answer that question, and I had spent 39 years telling myself I was working towards something without ever being entirely certain what it was. I know now. I know it in a way that has the weight of everything it cost me to learn it, and I carry that knowledge into every morning I am fortunate enough to wake up to. That is all I wanted to tell you.